All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a panoramic view of charitable giving trends. I'm Sarah Clough, Vice President for Philanthropy Insights and Analytics. We're thrilled to have you join us today as we dive into some critical topics coming out of the Giving USA 2024 report and ongoing Marts&Lundy research, and look forward to sharing insights from our distinguished panelists. Today, we will cover a range of topics, including trends in charitable giving across sectors, campaign performance compared to Giving USA trends, the impact of inflation on major gift programs, and the trajectory of transformational giving. I'm pleased to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. Penelope Hunt is Senior Consultant and Principal. Mark Kimball is Leader of the Healthcare Practice and Senior Consultant and Principal. And Martha Vogley is Senior Consultant and Principal. A key finding from the Giving USA 2024 report is that total estimated charitable giving in the United States reached $557.16 billion in 2023, increasing by 1.9% between 2022 and 2023 in current dollars. While giving reached a high in current dollars, it did not outpace inflation, marking a decline of 2.1% when adjusted for inflation. Even so, total giving remains above pre-pandemic levels, even when adjusted for inflation, and shows positive signs across the sector. Let's dive into some of those trends across the sectors. Martha, I'll start with you. What are the key trends in giving to education, and how do those trends compare with other sectors?
Thanks, Sarah. Well, first, let's look at the Giving USA findings about education. And it performed, in terms of increases year over year, and it performed in the top three alongside giving to foundations and giving to public society benefit, growing a little over 11% between 22 and 23 fiscal years. Adjusted for inflation, that amount is 6.7%. Still, it's $88 billion, a respectable amount year over year, and comparable to pre-pandemic levels. Before we get too far into these data points, I want to just make some distinctions between the types of institutions we look at in our education practice. So we have, of course, large public institutions, large research R1, D1 institutions, and small liberal arts colleges, HBCUs, a great gamut of types. And we also serve independent schools and boarding schools. And independent schools, day schools in particular, perform very differently in higher education than higher education. So we would typically see giving activity to be defined in independent schools by parent participation, parent giving, a modest amount of alumni giving. There are exceptions to that. Whereas in higher education, you see a larger proportion of alumni giving and more investment grade giving because of the multiplier effect of some research projects or large projects that have a multiplier effect on society. So there are differences, and I don't want to, for the sake of our guest today, I don't want to lump all education organizations into the same category. But anyway, having said that, the real story here, the through line, is growth in major gifts, and I know my panelists alongside me will have a lot to say about that. In higher education, we saw, again, significant growth in major giving, with significant, 37% of total revenue coming from gifts of $1 million or more in higher education, 19% in independent schools. Whereas the other distinction between these kinds of organizations is that in independent schools, we typically see unrestricted giving being a larger slice of the pie, restricted or transformational type giving to be larger in higher education. We note in our practice work, and we talk to our clients every day, that particularly in higher education, in those especially that are very mature programs that have had multiple successful, very large campaigns, we see more trends around targeted campaigns, focused campaigns, sort of campaigns between campaigns, and the super rise in transformational giving that's tied to high impact outcomes, and a parallel rise in donor involvement in those gifts. We see donors partnering with education leaders to conceive of really large, very significant, high impact giving opportunities, and their giving growing as a result of that. I would say that education also continues to attract many non-alumni donors. They look for opportunities to make impact through those institutions, and provide legacy opportunities for donors, particularly among research institutions, R1s. I mentioned for a moment ago the parent giving data. In higher education, parent giving is a relatively small component of the total, and the data is a little unreliable because schools count it differently from place to place. But we see among our client base that about 4% of total revenue comes from non-alumni parents. In higher education, that's both public and private combined, compared to 44% or greater in independent schools. There have been some questions submitted to this panel about the drop in participation. I think we'll come back to those later on in this discussion. It's an important kind of bifurcation in donor behavior with this, again, this super growth in mega gifts fueled by growth, frankly, in the stock market and appreciated assets, and the opposite happening where there are fewer and fewer gifts, even among some of the most reliable cohorts, like parents of independent schools. Those numbers are dropping as well. So those are some of the main highlights out of education.
Thank you. Penelope, how do these trends compare to with what you've observed in arts and culture sector?
Well, the Giving USA findings for arts, culture, and humanities, which is how they define this sector, is one of the bright spots of the report this year. The giving in that area grew by 11%, and even adjusted for inflation, there's growth of 6.6%, which is very significant. And it aligns with what we have observed in our arts and culture and higher ed sectors, where we've seen the significant increase in larger gifts that Martha referenced. And in our arts and culture clients, about a quarter, a little more than a quarter of their total revenue comes from gifts of $1 million or more. So we look then at the shrinking share of individual giving alongside the rising importance of foundation and corporate giving. And these are really significant trends to pay attention to in all of our sectors. Individual giving was down by 2.4% when adjusted for inflation. Foundations declined slightly from 22 to 23, but if you look back over the last several decades, giving by foundations has gone from 6% of total giving to 19%, which is huge. And Giving USA does not differentiate giving from donor advised funds, but we suspect that some of the decline in individual giving and the increase in foundation giving is that many individuals have started donor advised funds and are using them as their giving vehicle, and that shows up in the foundation numbers. And corporations are the fastest growing source over time. And we're seeing especially in the last 2 years, they've had significant growth in giving. And I like to note that corporate philanthropy is not actually philanthropic. Corporations give to accomplish a business purpose. And in the arts and culture sector, that business purpose is often visibility. So thinking creatively about how corporations are willing to invest, whether it's pure philanthropy or not, that can really help diversify the funding sources in the world of arts and culture where things tend to ebb and flow.
Thank you. Mark, how about you? Can you highlight any difference in giving patterns based on your experience in the healthcare sector? You're on mute, Mark.
I apologize. I thought I had unmuted even after so many years of practicing that. I thought it might be interesting just to talk a little bit about geographical differences and our experience around those. And so, for example, we know that healthcare institutions in regions of higher economic growth, and certainly many of the metro areas around the country, particularly those that have a density of academic medical centers, they have tended to still benefit from larger donations in the last few years. In terms of, though, the smaller communities, I think it's worth saying, our work with health systems, we have several, and they have hospitals in large communities, like I mentioned, but they also have many, many hospitals in smaller communities where these hospitals are, essentially the economic engine of those communities. And that's where people get, their family care. They look to that as kind of their medical home. And so there's a connectedness to them in really a grateful patient giving kind of way that has resulted in many of those community hospitals receiving and maintaining a very strong pipeline, particularly post-COVID. Again, those hospitals were the first line of defense in COVID. People have not forgotten that. I would say that also overall, those healthcare institutions that really have paid attention to those donors who gave during COVID and really talked about the impact that they've made, most often on the nursing and the allied health professionals who are really on the true tip of the spear on those teams. It's really made, I think, a big difference, particularly in the smaller communities.
Great. Well, we now like to turn to campaign performance, which always comes up when we have conversations like this. And we're going to talk about campaign performance that we're seeing in some of our client benchmark data compared to the trends that we're seeing in the Giving USA 2024 report. And I just want to highlight a few things before we get into some questions here. So our data shows that campaign goals are increasingly ambitious, which I'm sure you've all seen, with timelines extending longer, especially as campaigns continue to increase in size and economic disruptions become more and more common. And this really mirrors the Giving USA trends, where larger campaigns are really prevalent in sectors like education and healthcare and have the trends that we've just discussed. To provide some specific examples here, Marts&Lundy data shows that especially when we're talking about those quiet or leadership phases, they're getting longer. The median length of those phases prior to the year 2000 was approximately 2 years. In more recent years, it's increased to 3 to 4 years, so almost doubled in length of time. Total campaign length overall also increases as the size of the goal increases. Campaigns with goals ranging from 100 million to 500 million, we find average about 7.4 years in length. When we're talking about billion-dollar plus campaigns, which we're seeing more and more of across the industry, those campaigns are averaging 8.8 years in total length. Again, given to that vast amount of work and effort that needs to be undertaken to engage donors in an effort like that. We also find that institutions are raising a higher percentage of their goals before going public. So I'm going to talk about higher education specifically here. Campaigns that launched more than 20 years ago were averaging about 52% prior to their public launch, whereas that number has consistently remained around 60% over the last 20 years. And we continue to keep an eye on this, but we do see that that number has been increasing over time. And these trends really reflect the importance of strategic campaign planning and the the acknowledgement that demonstrating robust constituent engagement is key to a successful campaign and really engaging across your prospect pipeline. So this question is really for all of our panelists, and I'd like to get your thoughts here. What are some strategies that have helped institutions achieve their campaign goals despite the economic pressures that we're all well aware of?
Well, I'll start with this one, Sarah. A theme, again, you're going to hear from us that you're reiterating here is just the rise in major gifts, principal gifts, and transformational giving. And I found myself telling a client the other day that your first, your quiet phase or your early phase of your campaign is really a campaign of, it's 200 campaigns for each of the households you're working with at the top of your gift pyramid. So highly curated activity, very high degree of engagement, very high degree of collaboration between donor and institution and preferred outcomes. I just don't think there's any, I mean, this has always been the case that you mentioned quiet phases and public phases. And there's always been this pattern of kind of front loading a campaign, but never has it been more important to engage those very, very top prospects, those top investors early on to gain momentum and confidence and to telegraph to the rest of the constituency that this is a major event in the life of the institution.
I would say, Sarah, thinking about it from a healthcare perspective and what I've seen in the last year is, and no surprise, just places who have the technological expertise, they either have it in-house or they're buying it and using AI or machine learning to really identify prospects in a much keener way. I mean, they have sharpened the tool about as sharp as it's ever been in terms of finding these individuals, which kind of gets to the point as part of that strategy is healthy portfolio management. And that's something that we've seen time and again, where going in and working around healthcare organizations, development officers are really good at those, top, let's say, 20% that's in their portfolio. Oftentimes they don't know as much about the balance of their portfolio. It's not being worked as assertively, and not enough of it is set up for qualification, which ties directly back to this idea, you can find all these people with capacity and inclination through some AI analytical kind of tools. But if you are not on the other end driving those through a portfolio management process and doing it in a disciplined, really standardized kind of method, you're not going to be maximizing those portfolios. You're going to be leaving money on the table at the end of the day. The other point here, which relates to something else we may talk about in a few minutes, is that we know also, particularly around health systems, there is a reluctance to be adding more staff. The margins are so thin, and they're expecting everybody to tighten their belts, including the development staff, in spite of the fact it's a revenue source. So when they're not going to be able to staff up, this portfolio management and its productivity becomes all the more important for a staff, that's inhibited by growing.
I would add that it's important for us to remember that there is no one donor. There's no one donor profile, and not every donor is affected by economic swings like all the others are. We run the risk sometimes of assuming that if there are economic challenges, people will lessen their giving or they won't give. And that's making their decision for them. the very wealthy typically are not badly affected by general economic trends. They may be badly affected by their own personal trends, something that happens in their wealth world. But we have donors at every level in our organizations, and not all of them will be experiencing an economic downturn as a reason not to give, nor an economic upturn as an incentive to give. So listening carefully and focusing on engagement. The need is still there regardless of the economy, and the impact is still happening from philanthropy regardless of the economy. So continuing to tell our stories, and most important, continuing to listen to our donors' stories will help us make the right choice. And sometimes, as Martha referenced 200 campaigns, sometimes the choice of whether someone will give or not is as fine a line as just their personal stock portfolio. So you won't know unless you ask questions and listen to the answers. And if it's not clear, if someone looks like a prospect, open the conversation with a soft ask and just ask them, what's your philanthropic activity like these days? And can we fit into it? If they're not able to give or interested in giving, they will tell you right away. So don't be afraid to ask.
Really great points. And this really builds on when we're talking about these economic pressures. One of the topics that we keep hearing is around inflation. I mean, certainly when we look at the Giving USA results, we're presented the numbers in current dollars and inflation adjusted dollars. And so we really need to take into consideration the impact that inflation has on philanthropy, because it really is kind of circling around this conversation overall. Mark, when you look at healthcare major gift programs, how has inflation affected those programs?
Well, I would just reflect on Penelope's comments earlier. The work that's done around those key major donors and donors at higher levels than major gift giving, transformational principal gifts, targeting them as literally one, a market of one that you're really trying to understand, and really understand what impact that they want to make. So I think we can all agree on those kind of things. But the other side of the coin, is what inflation is doing to healthcare institutions these days, in particular. I mean, the margins were already have been thin since COVID. I mean, you're talking about 1% to 2% generally, which means that for each dollar that's given in philanthropy, a hospital would have to raise 5 to 10 times as much in patient care revenue to equal that dollar. And so that is a tall order in terms of trying to drive that amount of additional revenue into most hospitals, and so it becomes a lot clearer to the C-suites, who are wrestling with increased labor costs due to inflation. They're wrestling with increased indebted, what it costs, to get debt against new capital projects, much less, the labor and supplies that are required to build those capital projects. This is philanthropy is something where I'm watching the light bulbs go on in the C-suites time and again among health systems, where they're seeing it. They used to see it as a nice to have, but now they are looking at it as something that absolutely can contribute to their bottom lines. The challenge that we have is, how do we partner with our respective C-suites, particularly the chief executive officer and the chief financial officer, to really help them understand a couple of the things that I've said, is that the investment in philanthropy, particularly during a time of inflation, is going to be the best investments they could make. far greater than what kind of return they're going to get by investing in a service line. And if they see that kind of activity, they begin to feel it on what are the highest priorities of the institution. And that's really where the other corner that's being turned right now is there used to be just this desire for capital, bricks and mortar, or just give it to me unrestricted. And good development professionals are able to educate and partner with their C-suites at a time of these economic challenges to help them understand what philanthropy can make possible and what has to be done by the chief executive officer in terms of priority setting and their own personal engagement. And being able to get out and be able to talk about these kind of challenges in a direct way, in an authentic way with donors can help them, really understand how these economic circumstances are a danger to the kind of quality of care that grateful patients have come to depend upon.
Absolutely. And I think it also really highlights how important keeping track of these trends that we're talking about is, because you have that data to back up. This isn't just impacting us. Here's how philanthropy is impacting the sector, and even being able to benchmark against other clients like we're able to do when we're engaging with different clients is really impactful to just to show here's what your peers are seeing in terms of their return on those efforts. So really great points. Martha, what strategies can institutions adopt to manage the impact of inflation on donor inclination?
Sarah, I'm thinking about the whole trajectory of the Giving USA data over many, many decades. And those of us who've been in the business a long time have noted that the giving has tended to track the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So overall giving tracks stock market performance. But when you are in an inflationary period, you end up with, again, this kind of bifurcated donor base where you have the larger donors who've done very well in a what's still been a robust market, and whose assets have continued to grow and who make their gifts out of those appreciated assets. Whereas inflation really hits the donor, the smaller donor who's struggling with a household budget, for example, and has to make difficult decisions about giving even gifts that they previously thought were really quite heroic from their household budgets, but need to perhaps trim those or give them up altogether. So I think, for that first group, you're hearing this over and over: great engagement, great stewardship, great involvement in the conception of the gifts and their impact. I think for our smaller and more participatory donors, that group where we're seeing participation erode, the same message needs to go out to them about how much we value you, how much you are a part of our organization. It's easy in our client operations to over-resource major gifts because it's very productive, and under-resource, maybe it's not even intentional, but nevertheless under-resource annual giving, where so much of this giving starts, and which is really the backbone of the operation. And I think institutions that I certainly work with in education need to continue to stress the value of every household's gift and find ways to thank and engage in ways that is sensible for their budgets, but doesn't just write that group off and continue to erode participation. Also, we've alluded a couple times to creative giving options, the growth in donor advised funds, the growth in personal foundations. We need to continue to encourage our donors who are kind of in the middle of the pyramid to find those creative ways to make the best kind of gift. If they're motivated and they want to invest, but they're concerned about the impact of inflation, help them find creative ways of fulfilling their philanthropic desires.
Great points. I'd now like to turn to transformational giving and the trajectory that we're seeing there. So transformational giving is really a significant driver within all the philanthropy trends that we're talking about. Penelope, what insights can you share from our 2024 $10 million plus gifts report in relation to the Giving USA findings on mega gifts?
Well, we have to start with acknowledging that the concept of a transformational gift or a mega gift, those are variable terms. So Giving USA, for example, classifies a gift as a mega gift if the single gift is greater than 0.1% of total giving in a given year. So they round it to the nearest 50 million. So it's a very broad term. And for the 2023 report, a mega gift in Giving USA terms is $550 million or more. Now, many of us, most of us in our careers as development officers are not going to encounter a lot of $550 million gifts, but they certainly do happen. We just heard yesterday of the most recent $1 billion gift to fully cover tuition for medical, nursing, and public health students at Johns Hopkins from Michael Bloomberg, who is one of the most frequent mega donors. A gift like that is so large, and note that we've had 2 of those just this calendar year, those can skew a track record of giving very significantly. So while $10 million plus giving declined, according to our report, by about 21% from 2022, taking off the big gifts like the $5 billion gift from Bill Gates into the Gates Foundation in 2022, there was another decline from 2021 to 2022. So the trend is that fewer donors are making larger gifts because the amount given above $10 million, way above $10 million, continues to increase. And this is the point of the pyramid just getting pointier and pointier. And many of us on this webinar today think about, well, a $10 million gift is so far out of the range of what I work with on a daily basis. Think about what is a transformational gift for your organization. For you, a transformational gift might need to be $50 million or $1 million might be transformational. It's all just zeros. The thinking is still the same. Donor motivations are aligning with institutional priorities so that the donors feel they can accomplish their philanthropic strategies with these big gifts. Many times these are end-of-life gifts, they're estate planning, and sometimes they're just because the highest level of wealth, people are attaining it. Those who are going to be billionaires are becoming billionaires much younger in their lives. So they get to the point where they can think about these massive gifts younger than they might have done in the past. So paying attention to motivations of your donors has been a common theme in almost everything we've talked about on this session. If you don't know what your donor is trying to accomplish, you don't know how you can help them accomplish that. And if we ask someone for a gift to an area that's important to our institution, but we don't know if it's important to the donor, we may get a nice gift. But if we take the time to learn what's important to the donor, that can be all the difference between getting a gift and getting the gift. It's worth it to take a little longer, a meeting or two, to really understand where they're coming from, because that will set you up to solicit at a much higher level.
Really great points, and it's been interesting to see how there's been a lot more conversation around donor behavior. I was just working with a client where we were talking about the differences in donor behaviors when you look at different aspects of the prospect pipeline. So I'm curious for all of you, when you look at donor expectations and behaviors, how have those shifted, especially if we stay on the topic of transformational giving and think of post-pandemic, what have those behaviors looked like? And this question is for all of you.
Well, picking up on Penelope's last very excellent point about accountability and knowing what motivates the donor over, what the institution needs. You have to knit that together. And post-pandemic in particular, donors are and mega donors in particular are giving for very specific outcomes. It's very rare. There are a few exceptions to this, but it's very unusual not to have a very clear expectation about I'm going to give to this particular outcome, and I expect, very thorough involvement in this process, not just the stewardship report at the end, but really being involved throughout, having great communication with the project manager or the dean or the athletic director or whoever is really managing the way the sort of the throughput of that gift, and seeing the measurable outcomes and maintaining great transparency. We've seen, and I'm sure there are a few on our webinar today, our guest today, where a gift was made to the institution some years ago. Someone forgot about it. It's sitting in an account somewhere. It never got spent. That donor is never going to give again. So just, incredible attention to donor motivation and expectation about outcomes of gifts, I think will guarantee that you get to go back to that person for a second and third ask.
And Martha, I would extend that concept you're describing to hands-on involvement from the very beginning and all the way through the use of the gift. They often want to co-create a gift opportunity, and it's incumbent on the leadership of the institution to stay steadfast about mission and plans and make sure that whatever the donor is hoping to fund for you, you can afford to keep doing beyond the donor's initial gift. And we find that they want to be very hands-on, especially the rising generations of major donors in their 40s and 50s. They want to be hands-on with the work. And there are some types of organizations where that works beautifully. If someone is giving to Habitat for Humanity and wants to be hands-on, well, that's what Habitat for Humanity wants, people to build houses with them. But if they're giving to a child care organization, you can't have a stranger donor coming into a child welfare organization and playing with the children. In higher education, donors can't choose faculty members. And so as they want to be part of implementing the impact of their gift, we have to think really creatively about how to give them that opportunity without overstepping any important lines in our organizations.
Great points.
Yeah, and just to build a little bit more on this, when we're talking about the outcomes and the accountability that Penelope and Martha both spoke about, many health or academic medical centers, are really employing what has been their traditional business planning process in business development, and applying that to, if I'm looking at this service line and we want to expand or grow this particular program, what are going to be the revenue sources for that before philanthropy? What are going to be the costs on that? And of the delta, because the revenues always exceed the costs, how much of that can be funded with philanthropy, or are there some costs, that can be fungible with philanthropy? That's the kind of, roll up your sleeves process that will invigorate some of these kind of donors, to Penelope's point about getting them involved and getting them to take ownership. And it's something too that gives a C-suite much more confidence that this philanthropy is going to make a difference when they actually build it in to a pro forma. You know, it's not something typically we associate with philanthropy, but in terms of the way that particularly healthcare institutions are generating these ideas actually before they go out and ever talk to the donor, you know, they're trying to develop these things so that they know what does it take to become a nationally recognized cancer center or heart center or whatever it's going to be, and where does philanthropy fit into that picture. Much more proactive and systematic than it's ever been in the past. And I think that's true since you know, since COVID. You know, you've got people who, to my earlier comments, you know, they realize having a relationship with their healthcare organization is a darn important relationship to have, and they also know that they get closer to the life of that institution by being involved with a transformational gift. And that's something they value, their families value, all those other kind of things.
You
You know,
all.
Sarah, oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up sort of the inverse of what we're talking about too, which
Sure.
is something we've seen in recent months. There's probably, again, our guests have painful stories about this, which is donors withholding gifts or even retracting gifts over social, political issues or what they perceive to be the institution's position on particular issues. And you know, we're seeing this. The headline making cases are the very, very large gifts where donors are saying, I've historically been a mega donor to, you know, fill in the blank, and I'm going to withhold, and I challenge my fellow alumni or my fellow board members or what have you to do the same. And you know, we're angry. You know, we have the pitchforks and we're angry and we're going to withhold giving. But we're seeing at the lower levels too. You know, I think this is also having it's cyclical, not permanent, but we're seeing smaller donors choosing to withhold or greatly diminish their giving because they are displeased. And I think displeased with some position the institution has taken or its tolerance or intolerance about particular issues. And I think this speaks to a theme my fellow panelists and I are coming back to over and over, which is pay attention to what your donors value, because if you're aligned with that, your giving will increase. If you're not aligned with that, or you're tone deaf to it, or you're not communicating well about it, they have options and they will exercise them.
Yeah, all really great points. And that actually answered one of our first questions that we've seen from the audience. So we've received a number of questions from those that registered for today's webinar, as well as some that have come in live throughout our conversation here. So I'm going to pose these and folks can jump in where they'd like to answer. As I'm sure you're all well aware of, we're in an election year. How do you think that this election year will impact giving? And do you have any suggestions about asking around election season?
Well, I think you have to keep asking. And you know, what the data has shown us is that actually, in terms of transformational gifts, in the elections from 2012, 2016, and 2020, giving increased in each of those years. Transformational giving increased in each of those years because we've been tracking that. And you know, what we also know about donors is that they do not like uncertainty, right? And so there's, as we've seen, nothing more uncertain than the last couple of elections, and probably this one as well. But on the other hand, the discipline to continue to offer up your case during this period of time and to be able to talk about what the impact is during this period of time, you know, and how you're going to go to whatever those go to the heart of those philanthropic objectives that a transformational donor or any major donor has that's going to help deal with that, because you as an institution, you have to help them understand you are not uncertain, right? The election may be, but you are actually a good bet. And you know that through the leadership that we have. They'll do what they say they're going to do. And we have a track record of performing, whatever those kind of proof points are, that you are something that should be invested in.
Absolutely, that's really helpful. Another hot topic is how I'm wondering how educational institutions in particular can leverage DEI initiatives to engage a broader donor base and enhance alumni giving in particular.
Well, one of the major things that differentiates public universities from private universities is that public universities, many of them don't have a choice in these matters these days. We've seen legislation in a lot of states that has defined very specifically how public education institutions in that state can implement DEI initiatives, use them, fundraise for them, et cetera. Private universities don't face that same legislative environment, but their donors have feelings as well about some of the big issues of the day. What it comes down to, I believe, is people still want to help people. And if you can show a donor how they're going to help people in higher ed, maybe that's through student success initiatives. In other types of organizations, it's community impact or a particular constituency impact. If you talk specifically about donor, you can help a person, and you don't get tangled up in what kind of person, then you can generally find common ground. A donor who does not believe that DEI or DEIBJ initiatives are appropriate is never going to give to them. That doesn't mean that your institution can't make the decision that those are a high priority for you. It's about your institutional mission and values. And if you stick with your mission and your values and you stay out of trouble with the law, then you are going to attract donors who share a commitment to that mission and who share your values. So if someone's not interested, they're never going to be interested. Just talk about who they can help, and they will.
Another question we have here is, how are fundraisers asking for multi-year or campaign support when the current year bottom line needs to still be met?
The same way they always have. Um, we've moved well beyond the idea that there are campaigns and there is fundraising. It's all the same. No matter what type of campaign you're in, no matter what your priorities are, it is a part of your annual fundraising. And donors are smart. They understand the difference between a checking account and a savings account. They will understand when you explain to them, we're doing this, we are also doing this, and we need your help with both. They may not want to give to both, but that was already the case before you asked them. Explaining the financial needs, particularly noting the campaigns tend to be for stabilizing the organization's growth out into the future, whereas unrestricted giving or annual giving is more for delivery of service today, they'll get that. And yes, some of them will say, well, if I'm going to give to your initiative over here, I won't be able to give to your annual fund. The opposite will be true. And you'll find plenty of donors who understand the importance of doing both, but you have to ask them.
And I think too, donors actually appreciate the fact that you're going to bring them a combined ask, rather than doing a major gift ask, and then, 2 months
back.
later, they're getting something at the end of the year. Again, it shows a respect to them, that your institution knows exactly what's going on. You're going to make the case about, the impact of each of those kind of requests that come under the rubric of a combined proposal. And, there's always a lot of talk about that. And it doesn't happen often enough. Sometimes things break down because the deans don't want to, I'm overgeneralizing, the deans don't want to cooperate, or, the service line chiefs, don't believe that's the way to do it. But ultimately, good fundraising best practice is really something that's going to honor the donors' wishes and objectives.
Mhm.
There's a question that builds on this a little bit, and I'm going to combine it with a question that was submitted earlier. So when we've had some internal discussions around the differences in trends from 10 years ago compared to today, inflation is often a topic that comes up because it's very prevalent in how far that dollar stretches today compared to 10 years ago. We had an attendee submit a question here specific to those more annual fund level donors. So thinking about what types of messages are really going to set well with those folks that are feeling that squeeze of inflation more prevalently, those $10,000 to $25,000 donors or even below, and how do we think about their behavior and thought process around philanthropy, just given the things that we've seen with inflation and other trends over the past 10 years?
I think that's such a great question, because those gifts are so significant in so many of our client organizations. They are really the lifeblood, really the bread and butter. So it would be discouraging for a donor at that level to feel like the value of those precious dollars, is declining. I think this really gets back to something we've discussed numerous times today, and that is transparency and great communication. Ask yourself if your donors really understand how your budget is put together, because they have a household budget that they have to put together, and they understand when they go to the grocery store what's going on. And so for those crucial mid-level donors, who are, if you've done a good job of engaging them and stewarding them and communicating with them and keeping them close to you, they're going to understand that your institution, which probably has no more than 2 or 3 sources of income, is more reliant than ever on that source of the value of those mid-level donors and how crucial that is. So I say, every time you can, to put that pie chart of income sources out there, talk about it openly, be overt about your reliance on philanthropy to be not just a differentiator, but again, lifeblood to your institution. They're smart and they are experiencing the same squeeze. You want to make sure that they continue to see you as a priority.
I'll add to Martha's excellent list. Talk to them about the impact that they and other donors like them have collectively.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who's struggling to make the $1,000 gift that used to be easy for them, or the $250 gift, can think, well, come on, this is a big professional organization. My $250 will not make any difference. But when you proactively communicate, donors between $100 and $10,000 last year collectively gave this much money, and this is what that accomplished. It can get them to feel like, okay, well, actually, every little bit of this giving has a purpose, and I want to try to keep my little bit in there.
I'd like to expand on that even a little bit further when we talk about mid-level giving. So I know one of the things that we've talked about often is that divergence in between annual gift level donors and major gifts. You know, as institutions continue to increase their major gift threshold, that doesn't always mean constituents can bump up with that. And we found that across many clients, it's leaving a little bit of a gap there at that mid-level. So how do we continue to engage those folks? And we have a question here in particular around mid-level giving, around any suggestions that you all have on how to make more of a case for mid-level giving, investing in mid-level giving in that middle of the pipeline, using Giving USA data or some of the other data that we're collecting on a routine basis.
Well, I loved Penelope's suggestion about showing that when you almost create a giving circle that has power, you know, in that giving level, that there's, you know, there's great great impact. I think you just, again, you continue to emphasize the you know, the crucial importance of every gift, and find a way to thank and appreciate those gifts at those levels.
You know, we are seeing more people in terms of some titling being responsible for the quote donor experience and engagement, unquote. And this idea of a donor experience is not just for major donors or transformational gift donors. It's really kind of, you know, literally from the experience standpoint, is plotting out, you know, where do these folks, where might they enter in and stay involved in the life of your institution. And, you know, this really gets to, you know, it's one thing to send them a report about impact, or, you know, invite them into the circle, but how you actually keep them in the circle to show them the life of the institution and what philanthropy is making possible matters a whole lot. And, you know, healthcare organizations have special opportunities to do that because of all the reasons we've been talking about today. People, you know, are very curious, much more today because of COVID, about, you know, how things operate, how things work. And baby boomers who, you know, they've got the largest portion of the assets that they've accumulated. They're also the ones who are moving into that stage of life where their healthcare organization, I don't want to say that, forgive me, my colleagues in education, may be more important than their alma mater.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's the kind of stuff that you need to kind of play to.
That's just enlightened self-interest, Mark.
No,
But,
I don't know any donors. I don't know any donors like that, Martha.
No, I understand. Sarah, I was going to make one other point about those mid-level gifts. Something we can get really into the nitty-gritty of annual giving, but most organizations will allow you to designate, not restrict, but designate your annual fund gift at the $10,000 level for a particular purpose: student financial aid, buildings and grounds maintenance, the dean's discretionary fund, whatever that is, because it just flows into the budget and is as part of the operating budget. And I really encourage our attendees to, if you're not doing that, to do it, because it doesn't impact, you know, the bottom line, except that it may encourage more giving, and it gives you fundraisers a clue as to what motivates that donor to give, and you can steward around that. So if this person is making it an annual fund gift, but in support of student success, you know, your thank you note is probably going to look different than the donor who designates to something else. And I think that is an enormously gratifying means to continue to encourage those mid-level gifts, keep them engaged and feeling like you're really grateful.
Well, unfortunately, we're already at the end of our hour. We have a few more questions here, and I'll touch on how we're going to follow up on some of this information later. But First, thank you to our panelists, Penelope Hunt, Mark Kimball, and Martha Bogley. Thank you so much for sharing your invaluable insights today. I'd also like to extend our gratitude to attendees for participating and engaging in today's conversation with some really great questions that you've all submitted. For those that would like to access further resources or to revisit today's discussion, because we covered a lot over the past hour, this webinar recording and additional materials will be available on our website and delivered via email to those who registered for today's event. So you should see that in your inboxes soon. All right, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.